Hi, everybody. We've talked about some of the benefits of being in a music group like a choir or a band or an orchestra in high school or college. Back in 2012, I interviewed directors in District 279 from Osseo Senior High and Park Center Senior High and what's the other one? Maple Grove Senior High about, okay, directors, where have you gone over the last several years as a band or an orchestra or a choir? And so I'm going to go through them real super quick because there's just a whole bunch of them. But typical things that you'll see on tour when you go to any city, whether in the U.S. or abroad, are like museums, historical buildings and places. There's zoos, aquariums. There are famous restaurants, famous downtowns. There's universities almost everywhere, monasteries and catacombs, famous cemeteries. There's almost always a wonderful symphony, a ballet company, an opera company. There are cathedrals with choirs and huge, beautiful pipe organs. There are often street musicians and street artists. There are many state capitals and national capitals with big, beautiful buildings and parks and all that kind of stuff. There's often famous battlefields around there, fortresses, castles, palaces. Many of them have really interesting trains or ships, airports. There's natural stuff like rivers and lakes and waterfalls and oceans and mountains. There's often steamboat rides on whatever water's handy. Almost every city is on a river or a sea or an ocean. You can take a steamboat or some kind of tour boat ride. There's river walks. There's always shopping. Many of them have amusement parks near them, water parks. There's city and county parks and state and national parks. There's usually like professional baseball or basketball or football or hockey or something nearby. So there are just, no matter where you go, there are wonderful, wonderful things to do. All right, so let's get going. This is Branson and Springfield in the Ozarks. That's down in Missouri, almost to Arkansas. There's some super famous stuff down there. This is Bass Pro. That's in Springfield. Branson is a huge concert venue, and there's all kinds of amusement parks and rides around there. This one is Washington, D.C. As you know, it's our nation's capital. You could spend years in Washington. I lived there for years and didn't see everything. This is more museums in Washington. There's a gazillion museums besides all the outdoor statues and the Capitol building and the White House. There's the Smithsonian Institute, which must have, I don't know, 12 or 15 museums in it. That's the Air and Space Museum. That's the Spy Museum, huh? There's all kinds of wonderful stuff to see in Washington. And just across the river in Arlington, Virginia, is the National Cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery. Many very famous people are buried there, and they've got this Change Him the Honor Guard, pretty cool. Medgar Evers is buried there, Thurgood Marshall. Baltimore's just up the road from Washington, like maybe only an hour away or something, hour and a half at the most. There's all kinds. There's the waterfront, and there's famous ships there. That's where the Star Spangled Banner was written. The fort where that happened is right here. There's all kinds of, this is the baseball stadium there. This is more the fort where they were bombarding the fleet, and Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner. There's wonderful shopping and restaurants and everything right along the water. Okay, so here's New Orleans, way down at the foot of the Mississippi River. We're kind of up at the beginning of the Mississippi River in Minneapolis and St. Paul. New Orleans is at the very end of it. I lived there for 5 years. There's just so much to see in New Orleans. It's just incredible. It's the sidewalk artists, steamboat rides. That's the bridges over the river. There's the French Quarter. There's streetcars that still run. This is the cathedral there, and this is a very famous square where there's lots of musicians and stuff. All right, here's Kansas City. Kansas City is mostly in Missouri, not Kansas. There is a Kansas City, Kansas, but Kansas City, Missouri is right next to it, and it's the bigger one. And it's got a super famous train station, and this is a World War I museum. It's got the Negro Leagues Baseball Hall of Fame. It's a city famous for fountains and also for barbecue. That's the baseball stadium. Of course, Kansas City Chiefs are the reigning Super Bowl champions. There's all kinds of great stuff to see in Kansas City. Here's St. Louis, also in Missouri, but at the other side over on the Mississippi. The Arch is super famous. You can actually ride little ride cars up to the top of the Arch. This is what it looks like. There's little tiny slit windows. Here they are riding in the little car to go to the top of it. And then you can see, like, for miles and miles, St. Louis Cardinals baseball team is there. Here's the Clydesdales. From the Budweiser Brewery. There's, again, more steamboat rides. There's all kinds of museums. St. Louis is a great place to visit. I should mention that On most tours, you play for people. Like in a park, you might play for other high school kids, and then they play for you. You might go to a university and talk to the professors there, and maybe one of them will conduct you or listen to you and give you some wonderful comments. It's wonderful to go on tour with a musical group. So here's Denver. They built the airport to look like the mountains. Denver is near the mountains. It's like right next to them. Here it is, but it's not actually in the mountains. It's on the high plains. There are some here's an amusement park near Denver. This is an outdoor amphitheater. There's all kinds of great stuff to see in Denver. And then, of course, you can go skiing up in the mountains, even in the summer. You often can. All right, here's Rapid City and Mount Rushmore. This is up in South Dakota, way out west, almost to Wyoming. And, in fact, Devil's Tower is just maybe an hour away in Wyoming. Very famous thing here. This is Crazy Horse. They're carving a statue of Crazy Horse out of an entire mountain. It's going to be just huge. And, of course, Mount Rushmore is there with the 4 presidents on it. There it is. And the Badlands are not far away. There's buffalo all around there in some of the state parks. Here's Mason City and Des Moines, down in Iowa, not very far away. Well, Mason City is right up near Minnesota, and it's famous for being the town of music. River City, Iowa, is actually Mason City, Iowa. There's a famous musical called The Music Man, which was written about that. Des Moines is a little further down the road. It's got the Science Center. It's the state capital of Iowa. There's all kinds of great music and museums and outdoor sites in Des Moines. Great place to be. All right, here is Orlando down in Florida. Of course, they got Disney. They got Universal Studios. There's all kinds of attractions down in Orlando. Not far away is Cocoa Beach. Orlando's not actually on the ocean. And besides the beach in Cocoa Beach, that's where Cape Canaveral is. They launch huge rockets from there. All right, here's Chicago over in Illinois, not very far from us, maybe 6 or 8 hours on a bus or a short flight. Chicago is one of the biggest, most famous cities in the world. Here you are up atop of a super tall building, like maybe one of these, looking down on the city. There's all kinds of famous museums there. This is an aquarium, Shedd Aquarium. This is underneath the famous L, the elevated train there. Let's see, that says, what does that say? Something Universe. It's not Nickelodeon. This is Navy Pier, where there's all kinds of rides and attractions and shopping. You can see the big Ferris wheel there. Chicago is an awesome town. Has both the Red Sox and the Cubs baseball. All right, here's Calgary, which is up in Canada, out west. And it's famous for the Calgary Stampede, which just started out as a rodeo and turned into a huge thing. It's got some really super interesting bullet trains plus old-fashioned trains that go through the mountains. Beautiful scenery, wonderful city, kind of out in the middle of nowhere up in Canada. Here's Nashville. Nashville, Tennessee is Music City. It's home of country music, and there's all kinds of other great musicians there too. And it's got riverboats on the Tennessee River, I believe. It's got all kinds of riverboats and all kinds of, the Grand Ole Opry is a great music venue, lots of concerts there. And then there's Music Row downtown, all kinds of stuff to see in Nashville. Beautiful, big, exciting city. Here's New York City. Man, you can spend years and years in New York City. Not far away, of course, is Niagara Falls, but that's over in Buffalo. That's not next to New York City. Here's the Statue of Liberty, and that's either the Brooklyn Bridge or the Washington. I think that's the Brooklyn Bridge. Empire State Building, there it is again. There's all kinds of super wonderful shopping there. This is the 9/11 Memorial where the Twin Towers used to stand. Of course, there's harbor rides. This looks like an orchestra or a band. I can't quite make it out. A ballet. New York City Ballet is one of the most famous. New York Opera, the New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra. Man, there's just so many things in New York City. You can stay there for years and not see everything. Here's Boston, just up the road a little ways. It's of course, it was one of the most famous colonies. Massachusetts colony is still a super famous town. Here's one of the old three-masted, I think that might be the Constellation of the Constitution. Cobblestone streets, narrow streets. The Boston Common is a famous park. There's all kinds of museums and old architecture there and pioneer stuff. Here's a reenactment probably of the Revolutionary War. All right, here's Los Angeles and San Diego down in Southern California. They're not very far apart, and you could spend months in either one. There's Universal Studios up in LA. There's all kinds of wonderful, you go to Hollywood, you can go to Beverly Hills, and down in San Diego, there's all kinds of super interesting stuff too. SeaWorld, there's a cathedral there. All right, here's Oceanside, Pebble Beach, Long Beach, and Carlsbad. They're all on the coast between San Diego and Los Angeles. Carlsbad Caverns are super famous. There's a famous golf course at Pebble Beach, and there's also a super interesting drive along the coast there. It looks very rugged and gorgeous. This is the Queen Mary, which is in, I think it's in Long Beach. It's now a restaurant. It used to be an ocean-going ship. So California, there's just tons of things to do. Look at that beach. It just goes on forever. All right, here's San Antonio and Austin, Texas. They're a couple of hours apart by bus. Austin is the capital of Texas. San Antonio is a very famous Texas city. San Antonio is where the Alamo is, very famous battle area in the Mexican-American War. Austin, I think this is the Rio Grande River. I can't remember. I've been there. In San Antonio is a famous river walk. You just walk along actually a canal. That's up here. Austin has a river walk too, and I think that's this, along the actual river. I think that has something to do with the capital. It's the Lone Star State. I don't know if that's the state capitol building or not. There's all kinds of wonderful things to do all over Texas, and certainly in San Antonio and Austin. While we're in Texas, let's stop off in Dallas, famous for the Dallas Cowboys and all kinds of museums. And this is so weird. Look at this. Oh, wow. It's not about death. It's about how people don't think sometimes when they're in a mob. There's a big aquarium there. Six Flags Over Texas, super famous amusement park. Here is a rodeo. All kinds of interesting things to do in Dallas and Fort Worth. They're kind of right next to each other. Not quite as close as St. Paul and Minneapolis, but pretty close to each other. Here's Toronto and Winnipeg, again up in Canada. Both of them super famous cities. They've got cathedrals and museums and fountains, you name it, all the stuff that all great cities do. Here now we're going overseas. This is in Austria, Salzburg and Innsbruck. In all these old European cities, man, they have buildings not like 100 years old or 200 years old, but 500 years old, 1,000 years old, sometimes 2,000 years old, these buildings. And of course, all these European cities have great symphony orchestras, operas, ballets. A lot of them have super interesting train rides up into the mountains, fortresses, castles, scenery. That's the Alps there. Cable car rides. Vienna is also in Austria. Munich is in Germany. They're not very far apart. Orchestra, choir, castle, statues. That's a pipe organ in a cathedral. That's a cathedral, another cathedral, another cathedral. Cathedrals all over the place. Famous buildings, statuary. Look out, they're making out. Don't look at that. All right, Venice, Rome, and Pisa are all in Italy, of course. Rome is the capital, the Colosseum. Venice is up on the, must be the east coast, way up, almost up to the top. And Venice is the place where there's canals and gondolas and stuff. That's an interesting sculpture in Venice. Rome has, a million famous places to see. Pisa is the home of the Leaning Tower. There it is. Here's Florence and Pompeii, two more Italian cities. Florence is super famous for its art, all kinds of super famous art and art museums in there. Pompeii was famous because it got buried by Vesuvius. The big volcano blew up a couple thousand years ago and buried a lot of people alive. I mean, this guy was just like going about his business. So were these guys, and they got buried alive by the volcanic pyroclastic flow. Here we are in London, one of the world's most famous, well, Rome is too, and all these are, Florence, Pompeii, Venice, Rome. Those are all super, super famous world cities. London is one of the most famous. That's the Globe Theatre where Shakespeare got his plays performed. There's a huge Ferris wheel there. That's the London Bridge Tower, or that's, what is that, Westminster Abbey, Big Ben the clock. This is the Tower of London. This is Trafalgar Square, super famous fountain. There's the Tube, it's the subway. Just tons and tons of famous things in London. Sorry. Okay, here's Cambridge, which is right near London. It's mostly famous for being the home of Cambridge University and Oxford University. Somehow they're right there together. And also Eton, which is a boys' school. Here's Paris, one of the most famous cities ever, anywhere in the world. Paris, capital of France. All kinds of famous, museums and cathedrals and on, all the stuff I've been mentioning. The food in Paris is fabulous, on and on.